Thank you all for being here. I'm Stanton Wortham. I'm the Dean of the Lynch School of Education and Human Development here at Boston College. And on behalf of the university, we'd like to welcome you all. It's great to see you. It's an auspicious event. We're excited this year that we're launching the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics. David Goodman is the director. We're very excited to have this new institution here at BC to do some of this important work in theoretical psychology. It's wonderful to have this gathering. I know for many of you, it's the first time back after the COVID hiatus. Nice to see everybody in person. It's great to have this kind of work take place here at BC. This is an institution that really values humanistic inquiry. It's a place that has never lost that emphasis, comes from the Jesuit history of the institution. People in academia, you are what you do, you know, ideas are relatively cheap, that ideas circulate around and people borrow ideas and make them up. But we actually do particular practices. We engage in activities as part of our disciplines. And disciplines move into and move away from practices over historical time. Psychology as a discipline has hosted many great thinkers. There have been many wonderful and influential theories that have come out of psychology. But in the United States, that has been less true, that American psychology has been more focused on other sorts of habits, dispositions, and practices in which those dispositions are developed. Many psychologists in the US are extremely adept at methodological nitpicking, to use an evaluative term. The people are truly gifted at figuring out various ways in which different aspects, different subtleties of methods are going to have one effect or another. There are also people who are particularly good at models. People really like one figure models. If you can build a model and put all the factors into one figure, that's become an important aesthetic in many areas of the discipline. But theoretical and philosophical psychology has tried to preserve some other kinds of habits, some other kinds of practices that involve reflection and reading and conversation that are equally important, and that it's wonderful that all of you are trying to preserve and perhaps bring back or spread a bit more within the discipline in this American context. So it's great to see so many people committed to this sort of activity here. And I'm excited to look forward to this next session, which should be stimulating. David.
Thank you, Dean Wortham. I just want to say that I came to the Lynch School of Education and Human Development almost 4 years ago. And in my first conversations with Stanton, I told him about just how important it was to me, how exciting it was to me that in this new role, one of the things I'd be allowed to do is continue to build a lot of the work that we've been doing over the years with psychology and the other. And he expressed a willingness, which you never know what that means from an administrator. Still nebulous, but he has been true to it the whole way through, and has not just been supportive of it, but I have found in him an amazing conversation partner in terms of the intricacies of the thought involved in it, and the fact that he would advocate for the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics to launch this last year is a testament to that further. So it's very exciting to lean into this new frontier together, and I'm very grateful for your support, Dean Wortham, for both this event and all the work that we're up to. So thank you. This next address, we're doing something a bit different. And let me explain a little bit of the reason for this. Yes, it's the second address in this conference that we're putting on, but it also has two other functions to it. The other one is that it is the first Philip Cushman lecture. And because of that, the third thing we're doing here is this is actually being broadcast to a greater public. And the reason why we decided to do that is there has not yet been, following Phil's untimely death in August, a gathering that commemorates and memorializes his work. And we wanted to make sure our Division 26 and Division 39 colleagues, because he was a giant in all three of these divisions, they would have access to this particular address as well. So we're doing a few things here. And so I wanted to speak to the fact that we have about 100 people joining us online as well from all these different communities. And I think that's a real blessing. But let me not take for granted that everyone in here knows what the name Philip Cushman means. And so I'm going to use this as an excuse to talk about this precious man. On August 22nd of this last year, Phil was on his evening walk, as he does every night, on Vashon Island, and he was struck by a car and died. This stunned all of us, and it's been a deep tragedy that we have been all contending with over this year. My family had actually just visited him 3 weeks before in Seattle, and it really has been devastating for all of us. And again, we haven't been with one another since, so we thought this was really important. You see, this man was really one of the very greatest among us. He was not only a giant in the division intellectually, but he was a giant because of just how attentive and gentle and loving and fierce and intense, all wrapped up in the same human being. It was quite amazing. And he was a dear mentor and friend to so many of us. Before I ever actually met him, I had read his book, Constructing the Self-Constructing America, in the second year of my doctoral program. So I decided immediately to leave the field of psychology, because how could I possibly be a psychologist after reading that book? It undid me. But honestly, it was a type of undoing that has kept a fire lit under me all the way back from that moment until now. It has called me to a different way of thinking and approaching this discipline. And I've heard that exact thing from many colleagues when they talk about Philip Cushman's work. His work was in many ways mostly occupied with exploring how our configurations of the self and identity are both reflections and reinforcements of the particular socioeconomic and political horizons within which we live. And for him, that exploration has massive moral implications. This was moral work for him. Psychotherapy is moral discourse, and he wanted to drive that home over and over. He brought history and philosophy to bear on the subject matter. And he was a very passionate critic of our psychological discipline, but all for the purpose of calling it to a higher plane. I could go on and on about Phil, so I've got to leave it here for now. You'll come to know his work actually a little bit more through Lynn Layton's talk, and also the responses that are coming from two of his previous students, Bryn Lord and Kathleen Pape, who he adored. So I'm hoping also in the time we have with the audience later, some words about Phil can come up, and I'm sure that will be true throughout the whole conference, that this can be time to be reflecting our stories about him. Now, before introducing our speakers more formally, I have some news I want to share that is truly hot off the press, like it happened yesterday. When I was typing up these remarks that I'm giving to you right now, I look on my office phone and I see the name Ed Cushman, Phil's brother. And I've been talking with Ed and Karen Cushman, Karen being his wife, over the last 6-7 months, just discussing a lot of things with them. One of the ideas being the thought of bringing together an endowed fund in Philip Cushman's name for the purpose of being able to actually have something that goes into perpetuity that would allow us to support scholarship and events that is aligned with the type of work he was wanting to see done in the world. And this has been a long shot. We were talking about it, we're playing with it. To get an endowed fund is not cheap business, it's a lot of money. And the call yesterday from Ed was the family did it. They brought together a very significant sum of money that is the seed money that will now allow us to open up a fund to go the distance to close the gap and actually have something here at BC, hopefully in the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics, that will allow us to continue this work with Phil's name into perpetuity. I may or may not have cried hysterically in my office. I will not tell you. But we've been working at this for a long time. And so when there's more concrete details on this, I'm going to be sharing it out to the community, but we're very, very happy and excited that this is coming to be. All right, now let me introduce our wonderful speakers. We'll start with Dr. Lynn Layton. Lynn was a close friend of Phil's, and they were scholars who frequently engaged one another's work. It was actually Phil that suggested that I meet with Lynn when I moved out to Boston 15 years ago, and you were one of the first people I met out here, and you quickly became a friend and mentor. Her work is very kindred to Phil in many ways. She had got her PhD in comparative literature and in clinical psychology, so immediately interdisciplinary. Graduate of and has taught and supervised at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis and also at Harvard Medical School. She's the author of Who's That Girl, Who's That Boy? Clinical Practice Meets Postmodern Gender Theory, and 3 co-edited books as well. She's also been a co-editor of the Journal for Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Society, and is currently an associate editor of Psychoanalytic Dialogues. She was the past president of Psychoanalysis for Social Responsibility and founder of Reflective Spaces, Material Places, Boston. It's a group of psychoanalytic therapists who are committed to community mental health and social justice work. She's also been the recipient of an award just this last year toward a social psychoanalysis, culture, character, and normative unconscious processes. So very happy to have you here with us today. I'll introduce Grin and Kathleen as well, and that way you can all just have at it. Dr. Grin Lord was a doctoral student of Phil's at Antioch University, Seattle. She's the director and co-founder of the Center for Relational and Family Therapy and works closely with infants, children, adolescents, and parents in her practice. She's also a researcher at University of Washington and does a lot of research on trauma, PTSD, and substance abuse. She's also in the faculty at Seattle University in their master's in existential and phenomenological psych program, right? Kathleen Pape is also one of Phil's beloved doctoral students. She received her Master of Arts in Existential Phenomenological Psychology in 1993 from Seattle University and her Doctor of Clinical Psychology in 2014 from Antioch University, Seattle. She has a private practice and is active at it since 1999 and is a faculty member also at Seattle University. We've been actually working closely together on a project that we have here with the John Templeton Foundation, bringing together 6 Jesuit universities, and she's one of our wonderful faculty ambassadors for that. So, Lynn, take us away.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here, to be honoring Phil Cushman and honoring him with his students. I was on Phil pulled me in to be on Grin's committee. So this is really it's joyous, bittersweet occasion. So my talk is called Social Psychoanalysis, Theory and Practice. And again, it's truly a pleasure to be able to speak with you today about how I have come to conceptualize the theory and practice of a social psychoanalysis. My journey to psychoanalysis began when I was sitting in an intellectual history course during graduate school in literature, and the day's topic was Freud. At the beginning of the lecture, I seemed to be in perfect health, but as the lecture turned to Freud's relation to Fliess and Fliess's theory of the relationship between hysteria and the sinuses, I suddenly started to sneeze. By the end of that hour-and-a-half class, I had a stuffed up nose and a full-fledged cold. And that marked the beginning of my deepening engagement with and awe before the power of the unconscious. During my graduate studies in comparative literature in the 70s and teaching in the 80s, I was most drawn to feminist theories and practices and to Frankfurt School critical theory. Washington University, which is where I studied, was home to the critical theory journal Telos, and I was on the Telos Collective. I confess to being a theory junkie, but for me, theory always has been connected to social justice activism that at that time largely centered on feminism. Before I became a psychologist and psychoanalyst, my appreciation for unconscious process had already led me to try to understand how ideologies of gender, race, class, and sexual orientation become part of one's conscious and unconscious being. Stuart Hall, Althusser, Irigaray, the Foucault-inspired authors of the book Changing the Subject, were some of my intellectual mentors, hailing from second and third wave feminism, critical race theory, British cultural studies, post-Marxist ideology theories, post-structuralism, to name just a few of those spaces in which many, including many of you over the past 40 plus years, have sought to contextualize subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and the relationship between subjectivity and collective life in specific cultural conjunctures. So I was undoubtedly drawn to understand how ideologies operate unconsciously in subject formation, not only because of intellectual attraction to these theories, but also because of my own growing awareness of the disjunction between my own conscious and passionate attachment to feminism and the mysterious ways in which seemingly unconscious processes, the long brewing psychic effects of my 50s and 60s upbringing, seemed rather actively to be engaged in sabotaging those conscious desires and commitments. As my analyst once asked, admittedly mostly in regard to the fact that I was a childhood mediator of parental disputes, "What took you so long to become a therapist?" My psychology dissertation was on Kohut, and in 1990, I published a paper arguing that sexism was pervasive in his and his followers' theory of narcissism. And that's how I discovered the work of Philip Cushman. His groundbreaking paper critiquing Kohut's theory of an empty self resonated powerfully with my own critiques of psychoanalytic theory and practice. Drawing on Wilfred Bion's idea that development and thinking itself are hampered by unconsciously motivated unlinkings of all kinds, for example, between ideas and affect, etc. I pointed to what I thought of as an unlinking norm at the heart of both mainstream psychology and psychoanalysis, an active process that enacts an unconscious but thoroughly intentional and conformist separation of the psychic from the social. This unlinking, as they say, is a feature, not a bug. It's designed to sustain and reproduce inequalities of all kinds. So in the mid-90s, I was listening to Phil speak at a Division 39 meeting when suddenly I heard him say my name, referencing an article I'd written on Kohut. This led to a wonderful first meeting and then to several future collaborations, including Grin's thesis. Phil had made me feel like I had something to offer the field, and it was on a plane ride home from that very meeting that I first started to think about putting my essays, including the piece on Kohut, into a book on gender. Phil was a critical psychologist asked to speak at a psychoanalytic conference. I'm not sure I knew that such a thing as critical psychology even existed before I met Phil, and that was 6 years after getting my PhD in clinical psychology. Indeed, work with David and his wonderful psychology and the other team over the years, most recently as a reader and endorser of the new edited book on neoliberalism, brought home to me how rare these cross-field meetings are, even among people working on similar projects. Indeed, in that book, more than one psychologist spoke about how lonely they have felt in their work. It made me feel sad to realize how even within this small field of theoretical critical psychology and psychoanalysis, disciplinary barriers so clearly and intentionally militate against the possibility of establishing relationships like the precious one that I developed with Phil. Indeed, I could just as easily have been an active member of Division 24 as of Division 39. But my passionate attachment to unconscious process led to relationships with left-leaning activists in Division 39, particularly in Section 9, Psychoanalysis for Social Responsibility. So there I landed in around the year 2000. By the 90s, several analytically oriented clinicians were engaging with all of the above-mentioned theories and were actively involved in critiquing psychoanalytic theory. Straight and queer feminist psychoanalysts, for example, critical of the psychic effects of heteronormativity, began to challenge Oedipal and other normative and prescriptive developmental gender theories from the late 70s on. And many of them offered case material that centered on the damaging effects of heteronormative discourses on the psyche and on the therapeutic encounter. Analysts also began to take up class, and several Black US and UK analysts took up race and racism in the clinic. To a large extent, however, psychoanalytic practice historically and even currently has not kept pace with critical psychosocial theorizing. Although here and there we find papers, books, talks that take up what it might look like to develop a psychosocial clinical practice, many practitioners have been deterred, if not silenced, by the psychoanalytic establishment's fierce resistance against engaging with the political and socio-historical in the clinic. Indeed, to this day, clinical papers written in a psychosocial frame, including my own work, are often condescendingly categorized as applied psychoanalysis. In fact, the award that you mentioned was in the category of applied psychoanalysis, even though the whole book is clinical. But we're going to reclaim that. We're reclaiming applied. It's becoming, however, more difficult to ignore the increasingly loud and insistent voices of clinicians calling for a psychosocial clinical practice, or as I'm referring to it here, as a social psychoanalysis. This section is called Calling in the Ancestors, from and Fanon. Although many who assert the radicality of psychoanalysis point to Freud's free clinics, my conception of social psychoanalysis is most definitely not about making available to the masses a theory and practice that in many of its assumptions remains heteronormative, white, and middle class. The radical core of psychoanalysis is indeed its discovery of the unconscious, but to my mind, theories that purport to know the universal contents of the unconscious, as well as claims that the unconscious is either revolutionary or alternately conformist, are highly problematic. That said, through my work in a spiritually centered Black-led reparations campaign, I have come to appreciate a ritual that grounds most of our convenings, calling in the ancestors to honor them and to guide our way in building on earlier work. From its origins, many early psychoanalytic practitioners were socialists engaged with Weimar and Austro-Hungarian social reform movements. Fenichel, for example, wrote about capitalism and anal character structure. Reich spoke to the effects on character and defenses of the cultural suppression of sexuality. Horney analyzed the sexism pervading the analytic theory of her male contemporaries. Critical to my own work is Ferenczi, who critiqued analysts' disavowal of their position of power and spoke to how the disavowal is unconsciously acted out in psychoanalytic encounters. Two particular ancestors have influenced many of us who are calling for a social psychoanalysis, Fromm and Fanon. The Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, established in 1923, was perhaps the first school to bring together psychoanalysis and Marxism. One of this school's few practicing psychoanalysts was Erich Fromm, also a sociologist. Rejecting Freudian psychosexual theory, Fromm offered two concepts that bridge the psychic and the social unconscious and social character. The social unconscious encompasses all that a society mandates that its citizens repress, that is, not allow into consciousness. Fromm brilliantly analyzed how the social unconscious affects what is possible to be meaningfully said, as well as what is possible to feel and think in any given social formation. For Fromm, the social unconscious does not exhaust the unconscious. The unconscious contains all of what is possible for humans to be and do. Yet, he asserted that any culture's dominant socioeconomic system gives birth to a dominant character type, with all the defenses necessary to keep people from challenging that system's requirements. Here too, though, Fromm resisted determinism, even as he adhered to a rather classical Marxian base superstructure relation. When a socioeconomic system no longer meets the psychological and material needs of a population, the social character evolves. For a clinical psychoanalysis, social psychoanalysis, what is perhaps most revolutionary in Fromm's theory is his contention that the task of the analyst is to analyze what he called the, quote, pathology of normalcy, unquote. To do so requires clinicians to refuse an ethic of adaptation and to engage in, the quote again, a radical critique of their society, its overt and especially its hidden norms and principles, which certainly connects with our other ancestor today, Phil Cushman. Like Fromm, Frantz Fanon's concern was to combat the pathology of normalcy, to refuse to be complicit in adapting subjects exposed to colonial violence to a racist, dehumanizing status quo. For Fanon, the origin of psychological disorders is sociological, not ontological. In chapter 5 of The Wretched of the Earth, colonial war and mental disorders. He surveyed European psychiatrists and officials' views of Algerians' pathological character, only to demonstrate how that character forms in response to oppressive conditions. While illustrating how psychiatry and psychoanalysis themselves are entangled in relations of power, Fanon, like Fromm, yet believed that psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic and psychiatric theories could be of use in understanding societal conditions. Unconscious process was always central to his work. Nonetheless, his focus was not on the individual as sovereign subject, because he believed that subjects are constructed in relation to others and in relation to power structures. He argued that clinicians could not cure the individual without curing the collective. Fanon was clear that we all need healing from the violent and collective traumas of racism, colonialism, and imperialism. As a clinician, Fanon's concern, of course, was not with healing the psyche of the colonizers, but rather with the effects on the colonized of their encounter with the white gaze, with imperialist, racist systems, and with colonial war. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon spoke to the psychic effects on Black subjects of encountering and coming under the domination of the white gaze. In The Wretched of the Earth, he analyzed the violence wrought by colonialism on the colonized, as well as the psychic effects on freedom fighters of having perpetrated violence during the long Algerian War of Liberation. Fanon argued that the colonized were forced to internalize and act out the colonial relations that inject into healthy humans a dehumanizing epidermalization of inferiority. As a young psychiatrist working with Tosquelles, who developed an innovative sociopolitically informed milieu treatment at Saint-Aubin that he called institutional psychotherapy, Fanon became aware of how incapable most European psychiatrists were of hearing what the hospitalized North African Muslims were saying about their pain. Later, as a psychiatrist working in Algeria and an activist fighting a colonial war in Algeria, Fanon, like Fromm, refused to subscribe to an ethic of adaptation that would merely perpetuate the violence of existing systems of domination. For Fanon, to help Algerian patients adapt to the everyday reality of the racist colonizers who were waging war on them was tantamount to asking them to adapt to living in a tissue of lies. It would foster psychosis rather than treat the symptoms and dreams that derive from being subjected to an ongoing traumatic experience of domination, one that negated their very being. The question guiding Fanon's social psychoanalysis was this: what conditions would make it possible for the oppressed to live freely and healthfully? Political revolutions in and of themselves, he insisted, would not bring about liberation. Revolution must also foster the development of a new consciousness that would eliminate, quote, all the untruths planted within the subject by the oppressors, unquote. Now, focusing like Fanon on the mental health of under-resourced populations marginalized and oppressed by dominant regimes of power, Daniel Gastambide has drawn connections between liberation theology and psychology and radical versions of psychoanalysis. Like Fanon, Freire, and Martine Barrault, Gastambide takes up the psychic effects of oppression, endorsing Freire's view that the oppressed often deal with the violent ways they have been treated by identifying with the aggressor. For Freire and liberation psychologists, however, the oppressed are also understood to be experts on their own lived experience. All versions of liberation therapy involve helping patients connect with and/or reconnect with suppressed traditions and subjugated knowledges. Freire's goal of conscientization, helping people to develop a critical consciousness of what oppresses, be it racism, colonialism, capitalism, etc., again calls to mind Fromm's contention that the radical clinician's work is to surface and analyze the pathology of normalcy. Like these ancestors, I hold the view that it is not only the oppressed who need healing, but also the oppressors and all of those of us whom Michael Rothberg has called implicated subjects. While staying alert to the workings of dominant power, my version of social psychoanalysis includes the ways that all of us are affected, if not broken, by what BC professor Janet Helms has identified as the diagnosis responsible for almost all of our symptoms. And she did this in like a seminar hosted by the APA insurance company, white heterosexual male privilege, WHMP, which she pronounced WIMP. Now, I would add capitalism to that diagnosis, which too often is elided under the category of white supremacy. Although they're not synonymous, capitalism needs to be thought in intersectional relation with white supremacy. Social psychoanalysis demands attention to the location within power structures of both patient and therapist, but it also challenges us to resist reducing the psychic to the social or the social to the psychic. As Jacqueline Rose has said, the task is to, quote, hover uncomfortably in between, unquote. That is to account for the unconscious effects on subjectivity of the pressure to internalize dominant norms and dominant ideologies, while also attending to what such phenomena as slips of the tongue, dreams, character defenses, transferences, countertransferences, and repetition compulsions reveal about resistance to and life outside of dominant norms. Nurturing resistance to the very norms and hegemonic ideologies that have made us ill in the first place should be the mission of social psychoanalysis, and perhaps the mission of all work that aims at systemic transformation. The very existence of such resistance in people speaks to the failure of racist, heterosexist, classist, and other systemic oppressions fully to colonize unconscious and conscious process. Since the 90s, my work has been indebted to the relational psychoanalytic movement in the US. In my 1998 book on gender, I proposed a relational model of gender identity formation and development, by which I meant not only that gender identities are classed, raced, and sexed, that is, intersectionally formed within various social hierarchies. I meant not only that gender identity emerges from the relational matrices within which one develops, but also that they are classed, raced, and sexed. Thus, the norms of gender development in my specific subculture, class, racial group are related to the gender norms of dominant culture, as well as to the norms in the many other subcultures, classes, racial groups in a given society. It's all related to each other. As Irigaray and others have written, norms for proper identity performance are constructed as unequal binaries within hierarchies of power. Further, these norms are lived as bodily practices, what Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus, the sources of which are both conscious and unconscious. But against post-structuralist gender theory, I also argued that gender identity functions not only in the mode of subjection to patriarchy and heteronormativity, but also in the mode of resistance to subjection, particularly when gender identities are articulated to social movements like socialist feminism and Black feminism. Consonant with Fromm's ideas about what motivates human feeling, action, and thinking, I suggested that the longing for love, approval, and social belonging bear heavily on identity development. With a nod to Kohut's work on the effects of narcissistic injury on development, I argued that most of us are shaped by two very different kinds of relational experience. One that facilitates healthy development, and one that traumatically interferes with healthy development. In the latter kind, we are shamed, humiliated, or otherwise given to know that the ways we are thinking, feeling, behaving are not acceptable and not in compliance with dominant norms or the norms of one's own subculture. Shaming rituals produce narcissistic injury, shaping subjectivity by potentially causing various ways of being human to be dissociated, denied, and split off. While agreeing with Fromm that particular social arrangements pull for a dominant social character, I've drawn on Black feminist work and on intersectionality to complicate social character and deepen our understanding of what we might call character in relation, how characters emerge in relation to other characters and then engage in normative kinds of interpersonal struggles. If we've been lucky, we will experience some relational contexts in which we are met with love and acceptance of who we are. The singularity of individuals rests in part on what idiosyncratic meaning each of us makes of our experiences of both acceptance and objection. To be sure, to know the race, class, gender, sexuality of a given individual will never enable one to know what individuals have made of their intersecting and overlapping social locations. Nonetheless, reckoning with one's own and one's patient social locations and their synchronous and diachronous histories is crucial to an effective clinical social psychoanalysis. Because everyone has to contend with dominant norms, either in resistance, acceptance, or some mix of the two, the ability to identify normative character structures, defenses, and transferences might help clinicians recognize more of what is going on in the life and struggles of a particular patient. But we must also be able to identify, attend to, and nurture those moments of meaning in a patient's history that took shape outside of dominant norms, that emerged from affirming relational experience, or even just from knowing that what we feel and what our bodies can do are antithetical to what we've been told we should feel and do. Because most of the clinical theory that I had learned in the 80s and 90s completely disavowed the social world's role in the constitution of the psyche, I started to focus my work on how the mandates of oppressive cultural hierarchies are lived and how their psychic effects are enacted and unconsciously reproduced in the clinic. I've suggested that demands to conform to norms forged in the binary and unequal cultural hierarchies and ideologies of gender, race, class, and sexuality encourage subjects to split off from awareness those human capacities that do not fit the norm. As a consequence, the very constructs that we work with in the clinic, dependency, assertion, emotions such as shame and sadness, even models of loving, are gendered, raced, classed, and sexed. When parts of the self are encouraged to be split off and projected, the projections tend to land on and in others with whom we have become locked in relational repetition compulsions. If dominant race and class gender norms, for example, and this is true of my growing up, call on women to split off assertive capacities and men to split off dependency, the resulting dominant character structures, masculinity and femininity, might be marked respectively by grandiosity and self-deprecation. We might also then find that particular struggles and repetition compulsions become normative in heterosexual relationships. So the core of consciousness raising groups for me in the 70s and 60s and 70s was like we were all discovering these normative things that we had all experienced in our relationships. Norms for what it means to be a proper gendered, race, or class subject change over time. In my own lifetime, the norms for what it meant to be a proper white middle-class female changed radically after second wave feminism emerged on the social scene in the 70s, and women, or at least white women, were offered more opportunities for sexual expression, self-assertion, and fulfilling work. Such socio-historic changes create typical psychological struggles, yet they also make it clear that identity formation is fluid and dependent on changing contexts. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a few clinicians had begun to write about a particular type of enactment engaged in by therapists and patients, one that seemed unconsciously to reproduce racist, sexist, and classist social relations. Now, enactments occur when traumatic experience cannot be remembered and put into words. A core principle of the US relational and interpersonal analytic schools, influenced by Ferenczi, is that in any treatment, there are two unconsciouses in the room. As interpersonal school theorist Edgar Levinson wrote in 1972, we therapists can never be sure that we are better interpreters of what we say and do in the clinic than our patients are. Challenges like Levinson's to classical views of the authority of the analyst call on clinicians to be alert to mutual enactments, those relational interactions between therapist and patient that act out rather than analyze unconscious and unreflected upon trauma. And these are what I would think of as the pathologies of normalcy, these kinds of events. So what does this suggest for social psychoanalysis? If we believe that our psyches are shaped in relational matrices that themselves are permeated by the effects of class, race, sex, and gendered power hierarchies, we must consider the possibility that we, therapist and patient alike, might be prone to enact relational repetition compulsions that shore up the very social inequalities from which we have suffered. Indeed, case presentations do reveal interactions where, for example, a male analyst might affirm dependency and passivity in his female patients while denigrating these states in his male patients. Or a male analyst, unconscious of his own shaping by heterosexist norms, might encourage a female patient to experience her body and sexuality largely in terms of her desirability to men, rather than in terms of her own pleasure and her own objects of desire. I propose the term normative unconscious processes to describe those enactments that reproduce rather than challenge the split states that heterosexist, racist, and classist norms and relations foster. Understanding, interpreting, and resisting those kinds of enactments is central to my version of social psychoanalysis. Now I want to move to a section called The Big History: Normative Unconscious Processes and Neoliberal Racial Capitalism. A social psychoanalysis must contextualize psychic experience as broadly as possible. Davoine and Gaudier, French theorists, have encouraged clinicians to reckon with what they call the big history, within which patients and therapists alike find ourselves. To be able to do this, while not losing sight of the psychic effects of social location, we must attend to what Gramsci and Stuart Hall called the conjuncture. That is, and this is a quote, what is happening politically, economically, ideologically, culturally at any given historic moment. This involves, this goes on, quote, both an observable dimension, what is taking place before our eyes, as well as an invisible structural dimension, that which is taking place behind our backs. So I've done my clinical work in the US, and over the past 40 years, the big history has been dominated by neoliberalism, the current form of racial capitalism. Neoliberalism's core policies of free market fundamentalism include privatization of social goods, deregulation, union busting, downsizing and outsourcing, dismantling of social safety nets via, among other things, constant tax cuts, the rise of a surveillance and audit culture, vast income inequality along with mass incarceration, both of which disproportionately affect Black citizens and communities of color. These policies and their attending ideological frames have spawned their own versions of subjectivity and social character. The, quote, invisible structural dimension, that is part of Stuart Hall's understanding of conjuncture, would include those psychic effects of neoliberalism that foster all of the following: an intensified version of individualism, one that fetishizes meritocracy and colorblindness, competition, and as the human nature, competition as the core of human nature, an entrepreneurial self, an ethic of every man for himself, a work ethic that demands 24/7 availability and that encourages us to optimize everything that we can possibly optimize, a devaluing of relationship in favor of productivity, a general sense of disposability, precarity, and lack of trust in any institutions, self-worth measured by wealth, split states of grandiosity and self-hatred, which happen to be core characteristics of narcissistic personality disorder, and a general sense that any sign of vulnerability is shameful. The psychic demands of neoliberalism have fostered new articulations of gender, race, class, and sexuality, and encourage new ways of splitting human capacities that favor the conscious and unconscious reproduction of neoliberalism. For example, defensive autonomy, a psychic structure built on a denial of the psyche's formation in and dependence on relationship, a structure that has always been core to the production and reproduction of white male upper class subjectivity, began in the neoliberal 70s to be encouraged in all sectors of the population. It was especially rewarded in white middle and upper middle class women, like myself, for whom neoliberal capitalism offered new work opportunities within unchanged workplace conditions. Clinical enactments that unconsciously reproduce neoliberal subjectivities abound in the clinical literature, but they don't abound quite enough. There should be more. Normative unconscious processes also, of course, operate in groups and institutions. Rosemary Reek, describing the kinds of social defenses that neoliberalism rewards, has chillingly recounted unconscious enactments in which she and other therapists engaged in order to comply with the neoliberal audit and surveillance culture that had overtaken them in their National Health Service mental health clinic. One key finding was that completion of paperwork for therapists began to be experienced by them as equivalent to the provision of proper care. In the past few years, and especially after the murder of George Floyd and the so-called racial reckoning, many Black, Indigenous, and other clinicians of color, have spoken openly about the harms that they have experienced in their trainings and work milieus. Several Black clinicians in white-dominant psychoanalytic institutions are speaking out about institutional level enactments of racism. For example, the film, two films now, Black Psychoanalysts Speak. Black UK group analyst Gabrielle Kinuani has written about the painful silencing by white people of people of color in groups, including in psychoanalytic institutes. Citing Charles Mills, Kinuani invokes, quote, white ignorance, unquote, a motivated normative structure, a, quote, systemic group-based form of unknowing, disowning, or miscognition of the social order and historical arrangements that are both the cause and effect of white supremacy, unquote, and that reproduce it. Silence, she argues, quote, serves the avoidance of shame-based feelings in white people, which are projected onto people of color who may introject them, unquote. As Carter, one of my dear colleagues, has similarly argued, white institutions, including psychoanalytic ones, often operate as shame management systems that pathologize and silence those who speak up about racism. This system is intended to keep Black, Indigenous, and people of color out, to keep white people comfortable, to defeat anti-racist work for change, and thus to sustain the white status quo. I don't know if any of you follow psychoanalytic institutions, but they're blowing up, like the American Psychoanalytic is in the last few weeks, it's blowing up because of being confronted with their racism. One of the 5 dimensions of reparations that's cited in a 2005 UN report demands a guarantee of non-repeat of harm. Writing about how the ghosts of slavery and its afterlives haunt US psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic institutions, I suggested that white clinicians in white-dominant psychoanalytic institutions adopt what I called a psychoanalytic ethic of disillusionment. Citing Freud's statement, you always have to cite Freud, right? To be taken seriously. Citing Freud's statement that his whole life's work was to shatter the illusions humans hold about ourselves, I drew attention to the fact that most white people in the US are fairly ignorant about our racist history and are intentionally ignorant about how white supremacy permeates all of our institutions, laws, and systems. Perpetuating, if not perpetrating, systemic racism requires white people to live in illusion about ourselves. Such pathology of normalcy promotes symbolic and material violence. I began to realize very belatedly that the current conjuncture in the US, particularly the revolt of large segments of the white population against big government, i.e. social welfare, did not begin with the beginnings of neoliberalism in the late 1970s, but rather much earlier, when the wealthy elites of 1950s movement conservatism succeeded finally in connecting their neoliberal economic agenda to popular resentment against the gains of the civil rights movement, particularly against the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision that called for public schools to be integrated. It was really only after the successes of the civil rights movement that Nixon's Southern strategy and war on drugs were able to be articulated with movement conservatism, paving the way for Reagan's neoliberal revolution and for mass incarceration. Our current conjuncture and the social character it promotes is grounded in a racist neoliberalism. In the midst of my own belated consciousness raising about our long history of systemic racism, what Black feminist Christina Sharp has called the wake, that is, the afterlives of slavery, I was drawn back to Phil Cushman's work. While rereading a piece I'd first read in 2000, Phil's commentary on Neil Altman's groundbreaking essay about his work as a white Jewish man with a Black patient, I was awestruck by Phil's astute intersectional analysis of white guilt and its relation to capitalism and to power or lack thereof. In the context of my own anti-racist work in the reparations movement, in my Psychoanalytic Institute, and elsewhere, I realized that Phil was clearly onto the need for disillusionment, the Disillusionment Project, long before I was. In his words, and I quote at length because they're such important words, "Whiteness signifies a kind of political power that few in US society actually hold. It confers various degrees of socioeconomic privilege on certain groups, provided they remain silent about what they have given up and how others have to be degraded and destroyed in order for them to be so entitled. But privilege, especially such a tainted and tenuous privilege, is not necessarily power. And without power, privilege is just a kind of passing, anxiety-provoking, shame-inducing, and ultimately chimeric. Ultimately, he goes on, it is not so much the behavior of their ancestors that should make whites feel guilty today, but their own actions today. The socioeconomic conditions we allow, the overt racism we avoid facing, the corruption we do not really challenge, the covert racism in ourselves and in others that we do not comment on, the personal paralysis we tolerate in ourselves and in our communities. And as a sidebar, I have to say that were I not here right now, I would be at Boston City Hall participating in a hearing that's being held on what's called PILOT, which is payment in lieu of taxes, which educational institutions, hospitals that don't pay taxes because they're nonprofits have been asked by the city to pay, and which they variously do or do not pay. The significance of this movement is that these institutions are supposed to pay for city services, a part of this payment in lieu of taxes, and the other part is for the communities in which they dwell. And that's the piece that connects with what Phil's calling on us to do. What is wanted by the communities in which these institutions dwell is that they listen to the people in the community about what they need for repair. And I encourage all of you, whatever institutions you may be part of, including BC, to look into PILOT and see what your institutions are doing. Connecting culture back to the clinic, Phil continues, I'm not advocating a passive generalized white guilt. I'm suggesting that white guilt and shame are, among other things, covers for ethnic group and class self-hatred, and for the consequences of abandoning aspects of oneself and degrading others in order to become white. You know, in part, like Phil's really, because Neil's paper was about himself being a Jew. He's talking about a lot about Jewish people and what they've given up to assimilate to whiteness. And as a Jewish person myself, quite resonate with this. He says, I'm suggesting we embrace an honest, direct awareness of our political responsibilities and get to work. What can we do about the institutions that drive racism? What can we do to change the political structures and cultural practices, including psychotherapy practices that have created and continue to perpetuate racism? We must ask these questions, he says, and develop answers, or our work in the analytic dyad will be corrupted by the ill-defined wannabe guilt and shame of ethnic group and class self-hatred, and will be haunted by the guilt that should be present and won't go away, and both feelings will severely limit our work. We can do better than that, unquote. I can't tell you how prescient and how helpful these thoughts have been for me as I've struggled to understand the subtle and not so subtle expressions of white liberal backlash to anti-racist efforts in psychoanalytic and other institutions. I imagine Phil's words were rolling around somewhere in my mind when I called on white analysts to adopt an ethic of disillusionment. I hoped to disrupt those normative unconscious processes in white people that rest, as Phil wrote in 2000, on disavowing a history we know and refuse to know. Processes that work quickly to restore white people's psychic equilibrium whenever our general state of disavowal is confronted with the fact of systemic racism. Philosopher George Yancey has asked white people to develop a kind of double consciousness that counters illusion, a double consciousness that requires white people to see ourselves as Black people see us, i.e., as white, not as man, as subjects implicated in the systemic racism that perpetuates ongoing violence, even when we are not directly perpetrating violence. Lara Shiha has offered some general principles of what a reparative, liberation-focused, anti-oppressive social psychoanalytic praxis might look like. Principles that apply to and beyond the clinic, and certainly apply to our roles as teachers and mentors. A precondition of this praxis is to locate ourselves in systems of dominance and oppression, such that we do not use our positions to further oppress our patients, and that we recognize our complicity in our patients' suffering. An anti-oppressive practice thus begins with what Shiha calls non-negotiables that include calling out oppressive power relations where they exist, refusing to reproduce the ideology of a universal subject, and letting go of neutrality, which exists largely to shore up the realities of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and imperialism. To disavow these realities not only gaslights patients and all others with whom we are in relation, but also serves to reproduce a normative internalization of white class dominance. I hope here to have highlighted what I see as central elements of a social psychoanalysis and the ethic on which it rests. To reckon with the effects of oppression and power relations on the psyche, to reckon with how those effects can lead therapists and others in authority positions unconsciously to perpetuate or collude in perpetuating the very oppressive structures that have caused psychic pain in the first place. And finally, to find ways to resist repeating harm inside and outside the clinic. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Can you hear me? It gives me great pleasure to be with all of you here today, and I'm humbled to be a respondent to Dr. Lynn Layton. I'm indebted to her work and her research, which came for me at a very formative time at my life as a psychologist. As Lynn already mentioned, she was part of my dissertation committee about 10 years ago, where I wrote about the rise of trauma culture, and I was introduced to her by my dissertation chair, Phil Cushman. Lynn and Phil were consistent supporters of my writing, which at the time was a spiraling tome of around 400 pages. And I was maniacally driven to write it because I found out I was pregnant with my first child right after my proposal was approved. So it took about 7 months there. And Lynn was willing to go on the journey. I felt very supported as a young mother and upcoming scholar. Today, I'm going to be responding to her work on social psychoanalysis, interpreted through my experience as a student of Phil Cushman's, and in particular, how his work created a space for myself and other students to be angry and take action. This is my first Division 24 conference and certainly my first in person, and meeting you, Lynn, brings me such joy, even though it's also bittersweet because we can't share that we're meeting with Phil. But there's no better place to be than surrounded by those who loved him and his work. Today, Lynn said, we must be able to identify, attend to, and nurture those moments of meaning in a patient's history that took shape outside of dominant norms, that emerged from an affirming relational experience, or from even just knowing what we feel and what our bodies can do, that are antithetical to what we've been told we should feel and do. And when I first heard this, I immediately thought of being Phil's student, because he taught us a way to think about and challenge what we've been told we should feel and do. Although he might say we can never really live outside of these norms, Phil reproduced a tradition of resistance and a rejection of the dominant psychology in the space. For him, it was important to teach us to restore the history and context of every text we read, and to see our training as a product of a specific time, political interest, industry, and culture, rather than as communicating ahistorical transcultural truths about healing. Perhaps similar to Fanon's experience in Algeria that Lynn mentioned, Phil would not provide us, his students, a way to successfully adapt living into the world of being trained in psychology, which I think he would call a psychotic world. This is a world where psychologists learn to heal PTSD without learning how to identify or prevent the causes of war or gun violence, where therapists are trained to optimize their worth with procedure codes and reduce patient stories into two-dimensional, quantifiable, and ultimately reimbursable interactions. He trained us to notice the consequences of the big history of neoliberalism that Lynn discussed. In Phil's classes, resisting normative unconscious processes was first introduced to me through the framework of hermeneutic experience of Heidegger's falling out of everydayness. In my dissertation, I examined trauma treatment manuals for CBT, EMDR, and something called Battle Mind that the government produced. And I also looked at myself as a trauma therapist at the time as an enacting artifact of trauma culture. And like Marcel Duchamp's ready-made art, I began to ask questions that provoked a falling out and allowed trauma culture to look both absurd and also uniquely bespoke for this moment in time. Phil further fostered questioning of these normative processes in our psychological training through the language we used. For example, there was rejection of certain words in his classes. If we used Cartesian or scientific words like bias, validating, internalized, or empowered, we were pointed to the history of those words, their implications, and often in our papers, they were fully crossed out. Those are just a few of the words. At his memorial, I listed about 30. So he introduced us to Foucault and to Layton's work on the neoliberal gaze, but sometimes to our frustration, he also found it problematic when we reduced our interpretations to those frameworks alone. If we saw the world reduced to terms of power, capitalism, and gender, perhaps we would reify these structures and unexpected, specific cultural or even communal interpretations would not come to light. And as I wrote my dissertation with Phil, I noticed myself moving far beyond the positivist and ontic questions like how does trauma change our brains? And instead, I examined the human tradition and practices that allowed those questions to be asked in the first place. In the Jewish tradition of the Midrash, we interpreted and questioned, and anything that felt too good or too comfortable was most certainly heavily questioned. And so in that sense, his students were actually trained to adapt to the psychotic world. I just have a lot of emotions about Phil. Sorry. And I knew this would happen. We were put into the space of hovering uncomfortably in between, and we sat questioning on the edge of the clearing. But the end result was not total deconstruction or even living outside the norm. The end result was a feeling of being closer to each other while we navigated the world. And Phil said, the hermeneutic understanding is that we are not just isolated nomads. We live in a culture that has constituted us, and that is where we begin our decision making. And that is not where we need to end, but where we begin. The last time I spoke here at Boston College, it was in 2010 at Janet Helms's Diversity Challenge Conference, and I co-presented some research with Dr. Liang Tian on the reaction of white students to learning about racism in her psychology classes. And the predominant reaction was guilt and avoidance. This is now, popularized. At the time that wasn't talked about as much. The other reaction, which was rare and associated with growth, was a feeling of humbleness and a privilege to learn. And earlier, Lynn, you quoted Phil saying, it's not so much the behavior of their ancestors that should make whites feel guilty, but their own actions today, on the personal paralysis that we tolerate in ourselves and in our communities. And you ended with a call to action to name these oppressive structures. So in that spirit, for our community here, I think it is important to overtly state the relative lack of Black scholars and psychologists in this division. And not just our division, but in the field at large, and the need for even more featured speakers who are people of color. And I wasn't sure I was going to talk about that today because I'm not an active member here in our division, and I can only respond to what I've experienced in the past and frankly, what I'm seeing today. But either way, it's important to reflect on our complicity here. Scholars like Helms and Sharp and Sheehy and many others that Lynn referenced are calling us in to reflect on and calling us out to action here. In the piece that Lynn read, Phil noted that white people's disavowal of their intersectional, historical, and ethnic experiences, again, I think he was referring specifically to Judaism for himself, but in general was related to the subsequent inaction to address and work on the problems of racism. And in our training, I noticed that Phil introjected, contained, and ultimately expressed a lot of rage that many of his students were not provided the space or recognition to express otherwise in academia. And that has truly shaped me. In 2014, he gave a talk for the Institute of War Stress Injuries, and he said, we live in a broken, crazy-making world, and the only way we can cope with it is to avoid thinking about it. And we must know somehow that we aren't noticing what is clear as the nose on one's face. We must sense in some way that we aren't really equipped to study these issues and think clearly and creatively about them, and that our community and political structures are not equal to the task. What does it do to us to be so unconscious? What does it do to us to ignore the most important things in our life? And what do we have to do to look away from the truth? And then he went on to talk about expertly distracting ourselves with celebrity, electronic circuses, and other preoccupations to aid in avoidance. And Phil's articulation there felt right and correct to me because he's highlighting, things that we all feel. But what it also highlighted to me was how the dominant white male rage is taken seriously. Every time he spoke about this, it was considered to be scholarly work. So he modeled for me a way to move rage into writing and into action. And he listened to students who were being trained to treat the ills of the psychotic world. And I often felt by his making room for our anger and our rage in writing, there was a subversion and potentially a breaking of an enactment. So ultimately what these scholars like Lynn and Phil have modeled for me is a way to listen and act that is grounded in questioning and a return to moral frameworks. And to entertain the larger question of this conference of what a more humane psychology might look like and who might it serve, I do think we must first address the dissociation that Phil is pointing to, the lack of action, and continue to ask questions about isolation and representation here in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn, for your talk. Your work illuminates the political and social nature of our discipline and the practices that reinforce social historical causes of psychological pain and suffering. But importantly, you have offered a way to resist that, a new ethical response to our patients. Your concept of normative unconscious processes answers Phil's hope that, quote, perhaps other studies will be able to devise more historically situated and explicit therapeutic solutions to the problems of our time. In this response, I want to address a concern that you raise and provide a case example and a possible response to the concern for all of us. Psychoanalysts and psychologists have described the ongoing efforts towards and the implications of a depoliticized and an ahistorical psychology, what Cushman called, quote, a psychology without a critical humanities. He alerted us to the danger of disguised biases and prejudices when we try to convince ourselves that we are bracketing them off or eliminating them. And he rightly noted, no matter how loudly mainstream psychologists, APA-accredited graduate programs, and ambitious clinicians proclaim their loyalty to scientism, in the still of the night, we can't escape the grieving of our own hearts. We know something is wrong. Mutually reinforcing systems between clinical psychology graduate programs, licensing boards, and accreditation organizations like CACREP and APA, during an era when the data-driven technicist reigns, has led to a scarcity of critical humanities in psychology and an excess of instrumental methods meant to predict, influence, and control therapeutic encounters. When the curriculum of most clinical psychology programs includes only a small percentage of courses on diversity or history of psychology, and when licensing boards do not require any critical humanities courses, and in fact, sometimes will not accept a philosophical ethics course as meeting the requirement for professional ethics, then it is clear that psychology as well as psychoanalysis has, as you noted, not kept pace with critical psychosocial theorizing. In other words, in mainstream clinical psychology graduate programs, students must memorize a PowerPoint deck of administrative codes and professional ethics codes, but not be required to think about the very foundations of ethical behavior. It's astonishing when you think about it, but that's just it. Students and then professionals are not asked to think about it at all. Phil noted, quote, what we are teaching our doctoral students is how to comply, how to follow orders, how to be well-meaning, efficient bureaucrats, to support the status quo, promote their newly found profession unquestioningly, and in the process, enable the military industrial educational complex to function smoothly and to do so gladly. When reading your section on normative unconscious processes reproducing inequalities, it brought to mind my work with a relatively new client. She is an early 20s college graduate, originally from Asia, working in tech on a 3-year extension of her F1 student visa. Her fears of deportation or loss of work status is a daily reality. She has no family to return to who would be psychologically or physically safe. The lottery for an H-1B visa allowing more permanent status is a long shot. Instability, intrusion, and precarity are themes that resound in her life and in our work together. Any misstep, she informed me when we first began working together, a traffic violation, displeasing her employer, could lead to deportation and a shameful return to an unwelcoming and uncaring country. I have thought a great deal about how her and my therapeutic encounters might reinforce certain power relations and how both of us together may be enacting those unconsciously, our two unconsciouses in the room. In sessions, my client sits perched on the edge of the couch. I rest deeply into my chair, and in fact, recently in session found myself thinking, this chair is so comfortable, I can really sink into it. Her anxiety between sessions is almost debilitating. I literally hold the keys to our space and the code that deactivates the alarm. My consultant noticed that my client seems to thank me a lot, every session in fact, and express her appreciation for our work for that space. I'm so glad I can be here, she says. Would she feel less inclined to do so if she felt her time, her place, her home were more secure, that they would not be yanked away from her at any minute? Recently, I attended an art exhibit entitled Resistor, a legacy of movement from the Japanese American incarceration. It was inspired by the graphic novel We Hereby Refuse. The exhibit confronted the mythology conveyed in selective Dorothea Lange portraits and elsewhere of the stoic and accepting Americans of Japanese descent who were incarcerated as a result of Executive Order 9066. Rather than reinforcing that mythology, this exhibit celebrated and broadened and described the idea of resistance to injustice by telling the stories of those who refused to accept their incarceration. Making my way through the exhibit, noticing my previously held narratives about this event being increasingly disturbed, I think the beginnings of a disillusionment, I became aware of someone standing close to me. In fact, too close. I would move along towards the next panel or exhibit, and she would be right there inside my bubble reading the same panel. I started to feel crowded out, intruded upon, and annoyed. After trying to let her move past me and her not leaving my side, I decided I would just stay put and not be rushed through the exhibit, and in a very Seattle way, silently express my annoyance at her presence by pushing my arms out a little further. Slowly, it began to dawn on me that we were in an exhibit that confronted the anti-racism of our region. What were the traditions, the cultural norms that formed me and constructed a world that made sense to me? A world where I, while in the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience in the International District, Chinatown of Seattle, would respond to a perceived encroachment with the belief, I belong here and you don't. Who was encroaching on whom, and how might my unconscious entitlement be enacted in the therapeutic space? Last spring, I asked my supervision students if they had any ideas about how to make meaning of the disruptions of the previous 2 years and move on into their postgraduate years. 2 students immediately brought up a quote by Dostoevsky, actually a misquote. Art will save us, they said. The actual quote is beauty will save the world. Even so, they were on to something. In his Nobel acceptance speech, Alexander Solzhenitsyn contemplated Dostoevsky's comment. He said, the convincingness of a true work of art is irrefutable, and it forces even an opposing heart to surrender. Those works of art which have scooped up the truth and presented it to us as a living force, they take hold of us, compel us, and nobody ever, not even in ages to come, will appear to refute them. Falsehoods can hold out against much in this world, but not against art. It is true that psychology and psychoanalysis have not kept pace with critical psychosocial theorizing. However, the arts and humanities have. Maybe the answer to our concern lies less in graduate psychology curriculum and more in the dynamic and engaged world around it that has kept pace, even pushed the kind of critical theorizing that is needed. Psychology and psychoanalysis need not create this out of whole cloth. Phil reminded us that we live at the intersections of moral traditions, as philosophical hermeneutics holds. Therefore, we are not limited to one way of being and knowing the world. It is true that I am a clinical psychologist, but I am also a human engaged with my community, my city, my culture. Every day I pass public art, some even commissioned, most of it, shall we say, donated freely to the city. All I need to do is look up and around to have my comfortable ideas challenged, to be disillusioned. Maybe the arts will disillusion us by disrupting our taken for granted beliefs and making explicit what you identified as normative unconscious processes so that beauty can indeed save our world. Thank you.